Welcome back. I hope that you've all had opportunity to take a break and have a refreshing coffee or something else, as the case may be. I didn't even make it out of the room, so if you made it out of the room, you're doing better than I am. It's now my great pleasure to introduce, we've already sort of given you a trailer and forecast our keynotes, but the first of our three keynote speakers, Madina Tlostanova, is a feminist thinker and fiction writer, professor of postcolonial feminisms at, I will mispronounce it, Linköping. Yes, it's the ch. It's sort of like when kebab becomes chevap. I have to remember this. Linköping University, Sweden. Her research interests focus on decoloniality, particularly in epistemic and aesthetic spheres, feminist social movements and theories of the global south, the post-socialist human condition, fiction and art, critical future inquiries, and critical interventions into complexity, crisis, and change. Tlostanova's numerous articles, book chapters, and monographs have been translated into many languages. Her most recent books include What Does It Mean to Be Post-Soviet? Decolonial Art from the Ruins of the Soviet Empire, which I know has been a particular inspiration for myself and for members of our group. A New Political Imagination, Making the Case, co-authored with Tony Fry. Decoloniality of Knowledge, Being and Sensing, which was published in Kazakh, or translated into Kazakh in 2023. The co-edited volume, Postcolonial and Post-Socialist Dialogues, Intersections, Opacities, Challenges in Feminist Theorizing and Practice, with Redi Kubak and Surichi Tapar Bjorket, forgive my pronunciation, and the most recent experimental book of essays, which you were telling us a bit about yesterday, I believe, and it sounds really quite fascinating, so I'm eager to pick it up. A book of essays and speculative fiction titled Narratives of Unsettlement, Being Out of Joint as a Generative Human Condition, with Routledge in 2023. So currently she's working on a book about the stateless future, which I'm sure will give us a lot to talk about, but we're really thrilled and privileged to have you with us, Madina, and the floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for this generous introduction and also for the invitation to this most interesting event. I should say that this is not the kind of conference that I usually go to, and that's why I was very curious, because I don't come from any disciplinary framework, and being a decolonial thinker and writer for the last 5 years, I really, I am anti-disciplinary in all senses, and that's why when I see this kind of nice projects where you are interdisciplinary, you have people from different disciplines, and it's wonderful. But this is something that I kind of already forgot and stopped working with many years ago, and that's why it's very nice to come back and see our possible intersections and possible things that we could discuss together. And certainly the imperial legacies or inter-imperial legacies and the colonial legacies is one of such wonderful and important topics that is still not sufficiently addressed, or I would say not sufficiently addressed in a complex enough way when it comes to this particular region. So I will be speaking as someone who is usually presented as a decolonial scholar. And at the same time, I will be rather critical today of decoloniality, because I think that in the last 10 years, it has completely lost its momentum, its kind of steam, and there are many problems with decolonial discourse the way it is now, and also the way it is appropriated and misappropriated. And so even if I'm still considered as belonging to the core decolonial group, which is an international collective, and as I will say later a bit about that, I am increasingly critical. And one of my points of non-return, I guess, with my decolonial many, not all, but many of my decolonial colleagues coming from the so-called global south, although I hate this term, I think it's a very condescending, but still, if we somehow have to define it, I think one of the points of non-return was the Russian aggression in Ukraine. because they were not able to understand what's going on there, and their interpretations were very problematic, and I don't want to be associated with it. And that's why, I just finished a text in which I explain what is wrong with that, and some of these texts will also be mentioned today in the talk, because I think it's important to discuss it so that we don't see these discourses like post-colonial studies or decoloniality or whatever as some kind of monuments to themselves. You know, they have to be questioned, they have to be problematized, they have to be somehow attuned to what's going on in the world today. So I don't have answers. I should tell you from the start, I don't come as a preacher with answers. I pose questions, and I would like us to think about these questions together, reflect and make knowledge together, and that's the point of such gatherings, I think, and of any research. And I also give you another disclaimer that although Jeremy gave this bio of my, and I look like I'm a professor, yeah, I have been, but I don't like to be associated with the university or with academia that much, and I think that's why I started writing these non-conventional books, and I am kind of going more and more away from an academic book or an academic article as a genre. And once I realized how wonderful it is to be writing speculative fiction instead of boring articles, I just cannot cope with that anyway. So my next book is even more fictional than what I worked on before. And I'm very skeptical, to put it mildly, of the university and academia, and some of you know my radicalism in relation to that. And unfortunately, I cannot quit the university just as yet. Although I am working as a trickster, a decolonial trickster within the university, you know, you feel like a belly. You are in the belly of the beast, you know, and so you have to be radical from inside the university and dismantle it from inside, or not dismantle, but at least shake it, you know, with your decolonial gestures. And in that sense, it's interesting that Jeremy mentioned this relationship between activism and research. I don't have that problem, because for me research is activism and should be, and I think that this is one of the boundaries that modernity / coloniality actually imposes on us. Like, you either do research or you are an activist. But in fact, there isn't a difference and shouldn't be. And it's one of those things that modernity is so good at. For instance, dividing the human being and the world, right? And subject and object, or people and nature, or I don't know, things. There are so many examples of that. But of course, I realize that it's very difficult to get rid of this, the boundaries, right? Because this is what we are taught at the university. This is what life forces us to kind of, that puts this frame on us. But at least this is what we can reflect on in a critical way, and maybe hopefully slowly change. And for me, why I'm talking about this, because for me this is the most important part of decoloniality. When you question these frameworks, when you question these ways of looking at the world, of making sense of the world, of relating to other people, to other species. And many people forget about that. They understand decoloniality in a very instrumental way, and they just think that it's about decolonization. Another issue that was already mentioned earlier, right? What's the difference between decoloniality and decolonization? A huge difference. So we should mention that perhaps before we go further. So these are some things I put here, and I'm sorry, I used to write long and thick lectures before and come with this text and read it out, but I stopped doing it. And actually, why? Because I work in a very technologically based and kind of framed university, and people don't write texts there, they make PowerPoints. And so I switched to that as well, and then I realized that it's actually a very good tool, because it allows you to improvise, but at the same time it puts you into a frame of some kind, right? So I have points, bullet points. And don't kill me. It's not because I'm kind of a brainwashed, technologically framed person, but it helps to not forget things. So first of all, it's an obvious thing, the decolonial academic vogue. And I'm sure that all of you are familiar with it. Like in the last maybe 5-6 years, decoloniality, decolonize, has become a new vogue. everybody's decolonizing everything. You go to a conference and people are decolonizing nature, fashion, diets. I don't know. I very often get strange invitations. Like once there was oh, can you come as a keynote to our conference? It's a conference about decolonizing development. I was like, you cannot decolonize development. It's a colonial concept. It's like saying, let's decolonize slavery, right? It's like, okay. So people don't think that you cannot decolonize anything and everything, and actually it doesn't work that way. I think that you even cannot decolonize a university, because if you do, then it will collapse, which is good maybe. But I mean, if you do decolonize the university as the main knowledge production institution of modernity, then it will have to be completely revamped and made into something different, which I hope will happen soon. But at the same time, I don't think that we should use this instrumental thing, like let's decolonize this area of studies or let's decolonize that institution. One of them is decolonizing museums. It's another very, very famous kind of thing that people are always discussing. And I mean, I myself wrote some articles related to that, of what kind of tools you can come up with if you want to decolonize museums, how you work with representation and question it. But at the same time, I don't think that we should be too hopeful here. So what I want to say is that complete decolonization in this epistemic sense or cultural sense is not possible. It's always an open-ended process. Like we can work towards it, but we will never reach a perfect decolonized state of anything, including our own thinking, right? It's always something that we work for, but we never reach this. And that's why this kind of simplification is actually very dangerous, but this is unfortunately what happens, because when people, larger audiences, let's say, discovered this decolonial paradigm for themselves, they started using it in that simplified way, which in many ways makes decoloniality the way it was formulated in the late 90s or early 90s, let's say, if we take the Spanish version, as absolutely meaningless, And as Jeremy also mentioned, it's also instrumentalized by very problematic political forces very often. I mean, who uses the decolonial discourse or some of its elements? Very, very strange groups. Sometimes they are nationalist groups, fundamentalist groups. Sometimes, even Putin uses it in some of his speeches, which, it also makes it very, very problematic. So how you go about that? I mean, what do you do about that? Do you just cancel all decoloniality, or you go deeper and try to nuance it and see what was lost and what kind of things they picked up and cherry-picked from this discourse while ignoring other critiques. So this is something that I would also like to kind of touch upon today. And depoliticization is something that is the opposite of this. And this is what we find in the West. In the last 10 years that I've spent in Sweden, I've seen a lot of that. There are people who like to decolonize because it's so fashionable. And then you go to a conference and you see that there is no politics there. There is no discussion of racism or discrimination or Islamophobia. But it's just, they use the word decolonize, meaning deconstruct or critically analyze. So it's another vogue, that's why I call it a vogue. Like, okay, there was post-structuralist vogue some times ago, right? And so people were using the words, the terms from like deconstruction and other terms from post-structuralism to kind of criticize things. And now it's decolonize. And so when it's not really about any decolonization of anything, people use it as a substitute for something else that they really mean. And I find it also very problematic. And that's why, yes, it's important to talk about the internal evolution and the changes in decolonial discourse. And here I can tell you some things, and I have a first-hand experience because I started working with decolonial option and with decolonial thinkers in 2000. It was the year 2000. and they were absolutely not known yet anywhere. Their books were just starting to be published in English. And here we can remember Aníbal Quijano, who was mentioned today already, right? This is like the most important figure in decolonial discourse and decoloniality. Peruvian anthropologist, started as a Marxist anthropologist, and then he discovered the indigenous thought for himself and changed. And in his articles from the early 90s, he wrote many articles in Spanish, of course, right? And nobody knew about them in the larger world. And only in the early 2000s, they were translated into English and published. And at some point he said, my first works were printed in Spanish, and then I was published in English to give this difference. Like if you're in Spanish, nobody reads you, right? Which is not true, of course, but still, it was very different. The resonance was different. So anyway, when I discovered some of these first works for myself, some in Spanish, some in English, it was totally not known because it was still the time of post-colonial discourse. The post-colonial theory and post-colonial studies were in the center of attention, and this was the paradigm that was used to describe things anywhere, including Eastern Europe, by the way, and the Balkans. They were already the first works that were trying to apply these theories to what was going on here. Are sometimes problematic, I would say, because it doesn't really work. And this is why I existentially myself came to that, because why in the earth was I interested in that? And here we come back in a roundabout way to why activism is research and how it's connected with who is doing it. Because in decoloniality, there is a concept of the geopolitics of knowledge and the body politics of knowledge, which focuses on who makes research, from what positionality, how your family, your education, your position, racial position, gender position, sexual, whatever, influences how you produce knowledge. And I think this is crucial, and this is what I still think is important from decoloniality. Not in the sense that you are frozen forever in your positionality. Of course we are not. We are all changing, and we are different in different situations. But still, this trajectory, this genealogy is very important. Where are you speaking from? And that, of course, questions modernity in a very radical way, because in modernity we have the wonderful cogito ergo sum, right? The famous saying from the French philosopher. While in decoloniality we would rather say it's not I think, therefore I am. It's I think where I am. So this awareness, this locality of the discourse is very important. And in that sense, I can say I come from two colonized ethnic groups, let's say, one in the North Caucasus, Circassian, the Cherkess. My father and my mother was Uzbek from another colonized by the Russian Tsarist and then Soviet Empire space. So for me, I remember when I was 20 years old, the Soviet Union collapsed. And I was sitting and thinking who I am in this new country that claims that is a nation state now. I never became a nation state, I think. It was always a kind of an empire not quite collapsed, and having all of these fantasies, you know, and now we see the results of that. So, but at that point, coming radically from the Soviet Union, where at least there was a pretense at kind of people's friendship, internationalism, and of course there was a lot of racism even then, and discrimination against people like me, who are, as you might know, we are called the blacks in Russia and Soviet Union. So, yeah, I have an article even about that, which is called How Caucasians Became Blacks. So why we became blacks and how. So anyway, so at least then there was a pretense that, right, so we are sort of included in this Sovietness. But in the new Russia, we were not, because everything was Russia-focused, Russian language, Russian culture, Russian religion, whatever. And so I started thinking about that, and I started working on that. And I wrote a book which was trying to think of literature, of contemporary literature, of these authors who were not Russian by origin, but they were kind of Russian citizens in this new state, like myself, and they were writing in Russian. So they were trying to kind of create a Russian post-colonial novel, I guess, right? It wasn't Russian, but it was questioning a lot of things that was happening to them. I was looking for theories. I was looking for theoretical kind of things that could help me. I read lots of post-colonial critique then that was available, and I was fascinated with it. Some of it we saw today, and Jeremy was quoting them, but I was not satisfied because it was all about the British Empire and its colonies. It was Anglophone, some Francophone, but not much, and it totally didn't work if you thought about the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Union with its colonial side, the darker colonial side. And then I discovered these books by Quijano, by Mignolo, and then by Maria Lugones, who is my favorite decolonial thinker. Unfortunately, she's passed away a few years ago. She was a decolonial philosopher and feminist philosopher. And I think that she is the most interesting decolonial thinker because precisely she's less binary and more nuanced than many of others who are well known, like Walter Mignolo, for instance. But anyway, so I discovered it, and I was attracted precisely by the fact that even if it was coming from Latin America, and it was also limited by some Latin American discourses, at the same time they addressed certain things that post-colonial theory did not address, in my understanding. Maybe you have a different view of that, but I felt that they were trying to go deeper and question these very terms of the conversation. The way, as I said earlier, we frame things, the way we look at the world, the way we make sense of other people and others in general, right? So they were trying to explain that modernity is not just a time period. It's also this kind of framework that is imposed, and that's what Quijano is trying to say when he talks about coloniality of power. And then later Mignolo writes about coloniality of knowledge, and we wrote a book with Mignolo together about that, questioning this, right? So I was attracted by that, and I was attracted by still then present nuances that you could find in decolonial thinking, and that, as I think now, I argue now, unfortunately in the next 20 years, these nuances disappeared from some of the decolonial thinking. And one of the nuances that I think was important to keep and important to bring back now is the double critique. The double critique. I'm writing now a text about that in which I tried to see what happened with the double critique. Because, you know, in 2005, I think, 2006, we did a special issue of South Atlantic Quarterly with Walter Mignolo together. And we were trying to use decolonial thinking in trying to think about Soviet Union and post-Soviet reality and all that. And it was about double critique. Why? Because we were trying to criticize both the West and the global coloniality, and this sort of Russian imperiality and post-imperiality or new neo-imperiality, and the way it was kind of part of this larger discourse, but not quite, because it was also opposed always. Yeah, so there was a very interesting negotiation of these things. And so how important it was, if you are decolonial, to actually criticize both and not say, okay, if I'm against the US, I'm pro-Putin. No, you're against both, you know, but the problem is how you formulate it and how you kind of, you know, keep this difficult positionality. And subsequently, unfortunately, this double critique, they completely disappeared from all sorts of theorizing, and I'm going to write about that and maybe even raise this question in some of the decolonial, because this year is the 30 years of decoloniality official celebrations, and so there are many events that are organized in connection with that, and so I don't know, maybe they will say that I'm a traitor, but I think that it is important to speak about that. And also it is important for us to remember where it comes from. Do you know who first sort of formulated this idea of double critique? It was a Moroccan thinker, Abdelkabir Khatibi. Yes, quite an interesting thinker and poet and fiction writer also. Back in the 80s, he wrote a book. I don't know if it's translated into English. I read it in French. And it's about double critique, and it's exactly that, but in relation to Morocco. So he talks about the critique of the West and the Western Islamophobia, of course, and all of the Orientalism and all that we can all recognize. But he also criticized the local Moroccan society for its own limitations, and for its own kind of not allowing people to go in certain directions in their thinking. And then it was kind of taken over also by Muslim feminists, including Fatima Mernissi, who also used it in her book. And she writes in relation to gender problems. And she says that, of course, we don't like Western feminists who come and tell us how to become free in their way. But we also don't like the local society that also imposes certain things. So this double critique as a principle, I find really important in any discussions, because it helps to do what Jeremy was talking about, the nuance of the whole thing, to not kind of simplify it and present in a binary way. Because especially if we talk about Eastern Europe, Central Europe, the Balkans, we see this entanglement of different empires that hated each other, were kind of competing with each other. And people sometimes had to play as a very complicated game, right, in order to survive between these imperial kind of influences and outsmart them and exactly be these tricksters in these inter-imperial games. I would say that in that sense we should kind of avoid applicability, this discourse of applicability. Because I get a lot of questions, how can I apply the colonial discourse to the analysis? No, you cannot apply this. You have to come up with your own theory, and maybe in some ways it will be entangled with what decolonial thinkers say, but not. We should start always from the material at hand and not from taking some concept and artificially and mechanically applying it to whatever we're doing. And this is one of the things that I also always say. Well, that maybe doesn't need to be said. I don't know how familiar you are with decolonial discourse and some kind of very, very basic definitions. That coloniality is not colonialism. That is important, right? So it's not a historical specific kind of colonialism. It's this imperial colonial relations that emerged at some point in the 16th century with the so-called discovery of the New World and brought imperialism and capitalism together. And that's how modernity was launched, right? Then what did it need? It needed race. It needed racialization, and race is an instrument of dividing people and creating human hierarchies. And it's not to say that racism didn't exist before the 16th century. It did exist, but the way it was instrumentalized by capitalism and by Christianity of specific kind, of course, was new and very successful. And what is important is that coloniality is not colonialism of a specific kind that happened and then ended. It's something that we live with now. It's a trace of these relations that is with us even today. And that's what we have. When we go to the university and we have a specific course in history, it's fully colonial course, right? Because of the way it presents people, presents other nations, for instance, presents their struggle for independence or whatever. And if you go back and you analyze your own education, I'm sure you can come up with many, many examples of that. Even, in one of my previous lives, when I was a literary scholar, I worked in this horrible place in Moscow, which was called Gorky Institute of World Literature. And it belonged to the Russian Academy of Sciences, and you can imagine what it was like. And so people there, most of the time, were not doing anything because there are no students there, so you don't have to teach. And they were writing meaningless books. And it usually took decades to write these books. And so when I joined them, they were writing a academic history of US literature, and I was trained as an Americanist. So I was one of these authors, and they started writing it in 1946. And then 2003, they were still not finished. So you get the idea, right? And I remember that I was looking at the whole thing from like an alien, precisely because of the ways they were using this world literature paradigm, comparative literature paradigm. It was so weird. Like in parallel with that, they were writing a history of Latin American literatures. And I was asked to comment on a chapter, like a 200 pages chapter on Ecuadorian literature. So I was trying to find something interesting there. I was learning about writers, but then one of the first phrases was like, unfortunately, Ecuadorian literature is not as developed as European ones, and it never had romanticism. So, you know, yeah, so having a romanticism is a sign of civilization, right? So you belong to some world literature, and if you did not have a romanticism, it's not really what, it's like a pre-philosophy or not quite literature, and that is coloniality and learning and looking at things, you know, and using a certain frame for which everything should fit. I mean, I'm sure you have many examples of that. Yeah, and the second quote is important because it also kind of puts decoloniality into a frame so that it's not floating over us in some kind of timelessness, right? But it's trying to explain why it emerged at that particular moment. And this is what I used to call an elephant in the room, because my decolonial colleagues never thought about it before I pointed to this. And I said, do you know why Quijano formulates all of this in the early 90s? And they started coming with certain answers, and I said, no, it's because Soviet Union collapsed and all the socialist world collapsed. And that's why in that grim environment of this defeat of the left, to which, of course, they all belonged, they needed to make sense of it, and they needed to come up with some alternative. So what do we do? And that's why it's so important to kind of frame it that way. When there comes neoliberalism for everyone as the only kind of possible version of history or the end of history. Remember, there was Fukuyama with the idea of the end of history. Then it becomes very important to kind of reframe, to regroup and see what do we do if it's impossible to decolonize or to democratize the state. This is one of the phrases they were actually using. When they said that it's impossible to decolonize the state, they meant that the actual decolonization of the mid-20th century, yes, it happened. Many countries, as you know, became independent, but have they really become independent? By that time, people already realized that, no, they were independent on paper, but they were dependent economically, socially, culturally, and we all know it so well, right? That was one of the kind of sensibilities behind it. And why it cannot be democratized? Because of this collapse of the socialist world, right? So it was clear that that utopia is also over and it cannot happen. So in that situation, decolonial thinkers, they come up with an alternative, and that's why they go not in a Marxist direction, for instance, of economics, right, or revolution or whatever, but they say, okay, now revolution is not possible, now it's a neoliberal world, so let's try to change the way people think. Let's try to decolonize their thinking, their kind of sensibility, their gender, you know, their aesthetic aspects. And that's why the main works of decolonial thinkers, at least at first, concentrate so much on epistemology and aesthetics. And very much it's a result of this defeat, of this early 90s sensation like, okay, now we have to live in this wonderful, miserable, neoliberal world of capitalism. This is also something for which they are criticized, yeah, and still it happens today. And in that sense, I argue that decolonial thinking could not really happen or emerge in the previous anti-colonial Cold War era. It's a product of the grim context of partial defeat and the realization of impossibility to implement anytime soon the ideals of equality and social justice, or to decolonize or democratize politics and the state as its key institution. Yeah, so that I think is important to keep in mind when we criticize things, and that's why I have a problem when people just lump it all together it happens so often that people say, okay, so anti-colonial is a synonym of decolonial. No, it's not. These are two different things. That one happens in the second half of the 20th century, right? So it's a discourse like Frans Fanon, for instance, you know, other people like that. And decoloniality is completely different. It comes from in a different historical and political moment, and it needs to be taken into account. And I have a problem when now many colleagues say, okay, let's revamp anti-colonial discourses and say that they are still relevant and important. Yeah, they were super important and relevant in the 1960s, but they cannot work now, because the world has changed completely, and we have to come up with some solutions for today, or maybe using that experience, but not simply, again, borrowing something that was formulated in a completely different context. And that is one of the things I think we can discuss also. So this anti-colonial, post-colonial, and decolonial differentiation, and the fact that decolonization doesn't equal decoloniality. You notice the difference in the words, right? So decolonization as a process actually sounds much more fulfilling, like, yeah, you can decolonize something and come to a tangible result. Decoloniality stresses the fact that it's not possible, that it is always an open-ended thing, which may cause you to kind of dismiss it and say that, no, it's not leading anywhere, and it's maybe in some cases correct. Yeah, so that is very important, that it questions the modern colonial mechanisms of knowledge production and distribution, rather than describing or condemning different historical versions of colonialism, racism, classism, or attempting to formulate some kind of new wonderful theory, universal theory for all. And that is, speaking maybe in more philosophical terms, this ideational nature of this discourse. So ideational in the sense that many academic decolonialists, like Mignolo, for instance, or others, they are criticized for sitting in their wonderful Ivy League universities and not doing anything, right? So increasingly there is this gap between decolonialists as activists who are actually fighting in social movements, especially in Latin America, but also now increasingly in Africa and South Africa, for instance, a very strong and diverse set of movements. And these decolonialists who are seen as extractivists very often. And this is very interesting, how decoloniality as a movement starts questioning extractivism, of course, as a form of coloniality. But in the end, many of them end up being extractivists, knowledge extractivists themselves. And that's why I think I'm also having this existential crisis, a long one myself, because I don't want to act as an extractivist anymore. I don't want to come to conferences and deliver speeches and then pump knowledge from indigenous thinkers, you know, and write something based on that. I think it's very immoral. That is my thing, like, how do you go around that? How you still sort of pretend you are doing this, being in the university as an institution, as a modern/colonial institution, which requires you to do that. This is how you're forced, almost forced to write your PhDs or books or whatever. And how you don't lose that connection with real lives and real people or real, you know, other species, animals, maybe, whatever you focus on. And so that I find very problematic and very painful. And my way so far, maybe not so successful, was and is to work with artists. I started working with art long ago, maybe 15 years ago, meaning not describing art or analyzing art, no, but actually meeting with contemporary radical artists, artivists, sometimes thinking together with them on their new projects. Sometimes these projects are not just art projects, but they're activist projects. They are going there into communities, you know, and working with people. And also writing texts for them, of course. Yeah, because I can write text, so they asked me to do that. But it's a completely different sensibility, you know, it's a completely different vibe that you get out of it, because you have concrete things there that you want to reach, I mean, concrete goals of changing something, not just talking, you know, but actually changing. And that I find really rewarding. And unfortunately, in my case, it's still limited because, you know, being at the university, as you well know, requires, I mean, it sucks up all your time. But whenever I have some time, I want to devote it to this kind of work, which is not quite activism and not academic work. And as one artist told me, it was one of the first experiences, she asked me to write an essay for her exhibition, a big exhibition. And I wrote it, and I was struggling. I noticed that I'm struggling because I'm so brainwashed into writing academic articles. And then I just forgot about it, and I started writing as if I was writing fiction. And connecting with her art and trying to say what I think about it and what kind of decolonial emotions and my own sensibilities, the memory of space, the memory of sound, of smell, you know, childhood things that I almost forgot, connect with. And then I sent it to her, and I was kind of thinking, oh, maybe she doesn't like it, maybe this is not what she wanted. And she said, Madina, thank you so much. It was written out of love, and that's what was important for her. And I think that for me also, like if love, in a political sense also, love for the distant other is what kind of makes you do things. That's probably what can still make academic work meaningful, but we have to do it every day, you know, we have to work on it. It's very hard to not lose that connection. Yeah, so that was important. Yeah, that I already said. Yeah, appropriation, trivialization, depoliticization of decolonial discourses, as we mentioned, maybe we have to say it more clearly, happens from all sides and from all kind of political platforms, right? We see it in alt-right, we see it in some kind of very mainstream politics that are also trying to take certain elements of decolonial discourse and again use them the way they want it to look. And we find it in institutions, we find it in the university because we are in the university, and so maybe it's the closest context to all of us. We find it in this kind of ticking the boxes, you know, when people say, oh, you have to make all programs inclusive, or you have to have the diversity of people who work. Yeah, but then it ends on the ticking of the boxes. You have representatives of different, you know, races, for instance, right? But they don't really have any access to decision making very often. And that's why it's another way of questioning this and say, no, you cannot just appropriate decolonization to make the neoliberal university stronger. You have to work harder on that. And I'm not saying that we all have to do it. It's up to you what you decide to do. But at the same time, I think that this is one of the ways that decoloniality could go, perhaps, and then be able to revamp itself rather than being stuck the way it is now. So that's why I say delinking is not enough. And discursive reproduction of Eurocentrism and decolonial thought unfortunately still happens. So what I mean is that, you know, if you read any of the kind of classical decolonial texts, they all promise that they decolonize thinking. And they say, oh, let's delink from using Eurocentric terms. Yeah, but then they go back to these very terms themselves. Because if you want to explain anything, you are then stuck in Western or kind of, you know, categories of thought. Yeah, even when they say epistemic decolonization, I'm sorry, the word epistemic comes from where, right? So, but at the same time, there were some efforts at that. I know several interesting examples when decolonial thinkers, indigenous thinkers, they tried to actually write texts or do presentations using terms from, for example, Aymara language or Quechua language, right? Speaking of the Andean people. But then you risk what? You risk that nobody will understand you. If you come to a conference and you use Quechua terms instead of kind of Western philosophic terms or aesthetic terms, then of course there will be 10 people in the audience who will understand you. So it's a struggle. You have to decide, like, what is your tactical goal maybe, right, at that particular moment. Do you want to have more people on your side, or it's more important for you to be very pristine about it. And I say, okay, I'm not using the word epistemology because it's a colonialist term. It's very tricky, and it's something that we have to decide each time. The binary models, this is my problem. I mean, as I said, I like the idea of double critique, and that's why I don't like the increasing binarity of the decolonial option. And that's how we, for example, discuss it with several decolonial important figures. And when I was very furious, understandably, about the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, they were very hesitant, and I said, but then if you say this, it means that you are on the US side. And I said, no, I'm not on the US side, I'm against both. As they say in Odessa, both are worse. So it's like, you know, I like this saying, oba hуже, they say, both are worse. So, I mean, yeah, but in order to understand this, you have to really be against binary thinking and this black and whiteness, right? And this generalizing and homogenizing. I think that homogenizing and generalizing is, interestingly enough, one of the faults of many decolonial thinkers, because they are, I mean, in their words, they're saying that they want to, you know, help indigenous struggles, but then, strangely enough, some indigenous struggles and lives are more important for them than others. And this ignorance, this infamous sanctioned ignorance that Spivak was writing about, is still working, unfortunately, in that group of people as well, you know. When they don't know anything and they generalize. When we were working on many articles together on, for example, imperiality and coloniality and imperialism, whenever I was asked to contribute with some reflections on the Russian Empire, for instance, I felt that pressure that they were not comfortable with it because it was a wrong empire. It was not like a Great Britain, or, you know, it was not behaving in the same way. It was more complex. You had to take into account inter-imperiality that was mentioned today and other things. And so it was always, they were trying to simplify the whole thing and make it fit that narrative that was created in decoloniality, in decolonial option. And I do agree with Jeremy that it's not what we should do. No, or we should start with the concrete situations of this inter-imperiality and the entanglement of different influences. Sometimes not even imperial, but proto-imperial, not quite, you know, because it's always very, very, very kind of blurred, right, these differences. And also it's very historical, it's very much changing, it's not stable from one century to another and even within centuries. So that is an important thing that should be done. And that constructing imaginary enemies as convenient rhetorical gestures, you know that many people do that, right? And unfortunately, some anti-colonial and decolonial scholars do that as well. Well, for instance, when they speak of the collective West, or some kind of, who is this West? And I think that needs to be also discussed, right? And again, it depends, of course, on the positionality, on this, why are you saying this? Of course, in some cases, yes, the West maybe can be homogenized for strategic purposes. But once you go deeper, once you go inside these entanglements, you find that even there, some countries and some positionalities are insecure, unsafe, right? And sometimes they have very conflicting kind of powers and forces that influence them, right? For instance, now, as I said, because I live in the Nordic countries, I noticed that, like, none of the Nordic countries, you know, had many overseas colonies. They had some, but they were not very successful in that, and they came late into the picture, you know. And now, of course, because they have a democratic image of themselves, they don't want to remember that, and that's why, for them, what we could use is this kind of a sort of not direct colonialism, but at the same time feeling themselves to be part of the larger global colonial project or coloniality project, and it's a really interesting subjectivity, you know, that places them in a specific position. So you cannot just say the West, including all of them. You have to really specify, and that I also find annoying, and also that's what makes it's vulnerable, because whenever a decolonial position comes with this kind of overarching critique and making straw men or straw women, I don't know, whatever, then you can easily criticize that and say like, okay, who exactly do you mean? Which country, when, you know, and how? Yeah, and temporal models partially reproducing progressivist historical schemes. That's again, like there is a decolonial claim that we don't like this progressivist temporality, let's kind of get rid of it. Yes, I totally agree. But then when they start analyzing themselves, many historical processes, they very often come back to progressivism indirectly and not even consciously. So this process of decolonization of your own thinking frameworks is very hard. I mean, you have to constantly be aware of what you do and how you formulate it, you know, and can you really write a rational academic text, for instance, which is, of course, I mean, rational in a negative sense and logocentric in a negative sense, which will not be linear and not be progressivist. It's very, very hard. And one of the examples, that's why I said that it's my favorite decolonial thinker, was Maria Lugones, because this is how she wrote. You know, she worked in the United States for many years because she went there as a student and then stayed. But she never belonged. She never kind of assimilated in the United States and in the States, especially in academia, precisely because of the way she was writing. You read her article, and it's not linear. It's circular, right? It starts an argument and goes like this, and then comes back, and then goes again, and then deepens the whole thing. And it's very hard to follow this if you are used to linear articles with simple arguments. And she speaks that way too. And I remember that once when I invited her to our conference on that intersections between postcolonial and post-socialist feminism, this is what she did. She refused to take a black and white division position, right? A divisive position. And when we had a sort of a tension between people who were sitting in the audience, mostly these were people from Eastern Europe, from former socialist countries. And one of the other keynotes, she just came with her speech that was, I think, used before in a very kind of white Swedish context, in which she was accusing people of, you know, their privilege. I understand that you can find a lot of that in Sweden and also in other countries, and it makes sense because of the hidden forms of racism. But here it was totally misplaced, because she was addressing women who came from Czech Republic, Poland, you know, like places like that, Romania. And Maria Lugones was the only one who was able to overcome this tension and this binarism, you know, and this also colorism, I would say. And she was the one who stood up and said, I'm sorry, who is white here? Because she saw that these people were not white. I mean, they were racialized as coming from Eastern Europe or from the Balkans. And she was able to see this difficult and complex interplay of when you're white and when you're not, in which conditions you are considered white and in which you are racialized because you're not from you know, real West. And that's what I liked always about her. And the fact that she came up with ideas like, for instance, deep coalitions. Because we always talk about coalitions, and we say why coalitions are not possible anymore, why people are fixed on their differences, why people are just frozen in their you know, identity politics, and they're only able to see their own traumas and kind of claim that they are the main victims of certain, this victimhood rivalry is one of the important problems of today's world. And she was the one who said, no, we don't have to become identical. We don't have to become similar even. We can keep our differences, but still look for some ways and some dialogues that would allow us to share something. And then we can have coalitions, deep coalitions that are grounded in differences. And it's actually much more difficult than coalitions that are grounded in sameness. Yeah, when you're the same, yeah, okay, you have a coalition. But for her, that was one of the challenges, let's say, decolonial challenges. And I find it's even more challenging today, maybe, but still important to work on, especially when we live in this crazy, crazy world, which is becoming crazier by the minute. And in this situation, I think that coalitions are very important. But the question is, what do we base them on? And this is an open question. I would like to hear some of your suggestions. Is there anything that today can kind of bring people together and kind of in a broader sense, maybe people as a species, you know, to fight for or not? I mean, you can laugh at it, of course, but since I'm in Sweden, of course, I was influenced by Swedish thinking, even if I was trying to not do it. But one of the things that they really like in Sweden, you know, is a new materialist discourse. And all of this is connected with climate change and climate activism. At first, I was very skeptical because I was always thinking there are so many people who are suffering. Why do we have to think about rabbits or plants? And then I realized that actually it is very connected, right? And again, Lugones helped me to focus on that because she was the one who was saying, okay, first nature was colonized as a concept and was invented as a concept in order to objectify it. And then you know very well who is seen as part of nature. Savages, colonial people, indigenous people, women, children, what have you, right? Not only animals and plants. And so in that sense, I think it can be decolonial and should be decolonial, of course, depending on how you formulate this new materialist discourse and this critique. But I think that this is actually this challenge, the complex challenge and the crisis of the Anthropocene, although I don't like the term because it's very Western, but still, Anthropocene. So it can be one of the things that can bring people together because we don't have a future collectively as a species, you know. By the mid-century already there will be some changes that cannot be actually mended, let's say, right? So in that sense, the humanity and our planet in general goes to a very bad end and very quickly. So this is one of the things I think that could maybe bring us together, but this should be kind of formulated, this agenda, in a decolonial way, not only new materialist way. So there is an element of kind of climate research or ecological criticism, but there is also a political element there, right? And it shouldn't be erased out of these discussions. It should be there. So for me, this is maybe one of the possible starting points for coalition making. And as I said, for me, it's probably happening more in, not in research, not in academic research with its limitations, but in the artistic interventions, in art as research. This is something that I also work a lot now, trying to say basically in simple terms that you don't have to write a book or an article to do research or do some kind of even field work. You can make an artwork, and this is equal in knowledge making, right? So it's very interesting to work with artists and actually see how they produce knowledge. What are their ways of doing it? And especially not only with visual artists with whom I work a lot, but also with filmmakers. And recently my friends and colleagues in KTH and Royal Academy of Technologies in Stockholm, they made a really interesting film festival, Crosscuts, in which the idea was not to just watch films and discuss them, but actually films themselves were like articles. They were part of research. So for example, if you were hired as a reviewer, for example, if you are reviewing an article for a peer-reviewed journal, you know the process, right? But in this case, it was the films. For instance, you get a film which is not finished yet, and you write a review of the film with your comments and suggestions, and then they remake the film, and the final project takes into account what you said. So they were not documentaries, they were not video art, they were not feature films, but they were like research papers made on film, which I found fascinating because there are so many things that you can show rather than explain in that logocentric way. That's wonderful, I think, one of the ways to go. And yeah, that I already mentioned, the double translation, double critique. Purity impurity is another concept that Lugones works with, or rather I should say worked with. She came up with it in the 1980s, I think, long before decoloniality was actually formulated as a discourse. So it's an article that is written outside of decolonial framework still. There was no theory there. But it's wonderful. exactly for the same reason, because it's not binary, because she works with nuances, and she says that nothing is completely pure or impure. There's always this kind of shadowy, kind of blurred boundary, which I like. And Lugones, being a feminist thinker and very kind of corporal also, yeah, corporality is an important element of her thinking. She thinks with the body. So she writes, she uses culinary metaphors. And that in that article also she says, like, okay, imagine that you are making mayonnaise at home. So how you make it and how in this process sometimes it's not successful. And so so it's kind of gets divided, right? The oil and the other parts of it. And you see that state, that's condition of being not pure and not impure, but something in between, right? And she talks about people, about identities, about positionalities in that similar way, right? So this impurity, I think, is also very productive if we think of decolonial thinking and decoloniality in general. So what do we do about this? What do we do about this intersectional kind of, because of course it's very intersectional, state when none of us is always a victim or always a perpetrator. We are constantly changing this, right? And so how this juggling happens based on what? And how to also, maybe I would risk saying this, how to get rid of this usual approach to this when we build a narrative in which usually there should be a perpetrator and a victim, and then you have a moral of some kind in the end. So yeah, it's important to have that, but it's also important to question that and to complexify that. Not to say that perpetrators are wonderful, of course not, but to also place it in a very difficult context and understand how it actually works. These are some concepts that actually rhyme together, because transculturation is also, as you know, some of you know about that very much. And agonistics that we mentioned yesterday, I think, going here from Zagreb. Agonistics is also one of the concepts that Maria Lugones works with. It's in another article, classical text by her, about world traveling and the loving perception. So in that article, she also starts with the idea that living in a modern colonial culture, we are from very early on educated into being agonistic, into competing with someone all the time, and into this arrogant perception of others, as she formulates it, right? So she says how to learn to not be arrogant when you treat other people, how to avoid this agonistics and competition all the time, right? And see this other with a loving perception. So this is something that is also important, because I think that if we consider indeed love as a political category for the future, for refuturing, then we also have to question agonistics and question this sort of relationship and relationality based on agonistics. Defamiliarization and disidentification, of course you're familiar with these concepts, I'm sure, because they're not only decolonial, but I think that if we were asked to define the point, the gist of decoloniality, not using decolonial terms, to me it will be defamiliarization. Or estrangement effect, if you wish, right? So you look at modernity from this defamiliarized position, and all of a sudden you see how awful it is. But in order to do that, you have to defamiliarize, you have to make that step backwards, you know, and look at it kind of from a different angle, sort of, and that's how it emerged. But then the trick is how to keep it, how to not go back to this binary thinking, not to slide back to this easy binarity. That's easier said than done, of course. And these are some things. I'm not going to go too deep into that because we don't have that much time left. The decoloniality in and from peripheral and semi-peripheral spaces and no longer post-Soviet temple localities. I don't mind this clumsy term, no longer post-socialist I came up with it recently because I was asked to write some article, and people were still stuck with this post-socialist, and I said, well, they're not post-socialist anymore. I mean, there's so many years that have passed, and people worked with it a lot, you know. Some of them refused to be seen as post-socialist. Even if you talk with post-Soviet, former Soviet republics, many of them don't want to be called that, right? So, for instance, my Estonian colleagues recently, they told me, no, we don't want to be post-Soviet or post-socialist. We are not even Eastern European, we are Scandinavian. So just, yeah, this is one position, right? And then people in Georgia said also to me, like, we don't want to be called that. So it's something that is erased, which is also maybe not true, right, and not correct, because you cannot just erase it. I always say I cannot erase it in myself. I had the misfortune of being born there in that country at that point, right? So if I wanted not to be, I will be post-Soviet. It's a human condition, right, that you cannot undo, or being post-colonial also, you cannot undo this. But at the same time, this no longerness, it also kind of indicates that trace. Yeah, we don't want to be called that, but we still are in some ways connected, and we have to acknowledge that if we want to kind of make sense of what we do. So the imperial difference. This is something that was formulated from the start in decolonial option, but then again, as double critique, was forgotten, unfortunately. And today, not many of them write any interesting things about that, except people in the Balkans, people in Eastern Europe. There are really interesting works written on that. And sometimes they don't call it inter-imperiality. I mean, they call it inter-imperiality rather than imperial difference, but it's a very similar concept. It's a fact that there are different kind of rankings of empires, right? And some of them are more successful, others are less successful, some are capitalist, others are not, some are Western, others are not, like the Ottoman Sultanate, for instance, right? So that difference and that hierarchy of empires is what is important, and not just hierarchy, but also imperial rivalry, right? But also the way then they position themselves in relation to these more successful and westernized empires, and how it creates these inferiority complexes, sometimes compensations for them. That is something that was not in the original decolonial theory. They described it in relation to the early times, the 16th century, 17th century, when it was about the history, for example, of the Spanish Empire and how it was becoming the periphery of Europe slowly, right, in the second phase of modernity, or in relation to other such spaces. But they never took it further. They never took it to the 19th century or to the 20th century, while I think it is important because the results of this are still there. We still live with these sensibilities, and that's why your project is so important, because it addresses exactly that. So yeah, inter-imperiality by Laura Doyle was already mentioned here, you know that. And if we speak of places where I come from, like the Caucasus or Central Asia, it's the colonial difference of the imperial difference. Because you have Russia with its imperial difference, and you have the colonial spaces of this second-rate empire. That feel this double coloniality, right? So they have different layers of coloniality. It's the West and the global one, it's the Russian one, and so they have this double and triple and sometimes multiple pressure or duress, right? To use this wonderful term, like, yeah. And also recently I found these three authors, Bukovetsky, Varsiniak, and Roblewska. I'm sorry if I mispronounce Polish names, but they are really great authors who co-wrote an article, and they reformulated double critique. They don't use the term double critique. They don't call it Khatibi. But at the same time, what they speak about is very similar, but in relation to the Polish context. They write about the dangers of nationalism today, and also the duress and this continuous kind of traces of, they call it not imperial, but they call it foreign powers, different foreign powers' influence of what happened in Poland, and how important it is for the rethinking of history and memory work. And so it's the same principle again. Like, yeah, we critique the colonizers or other powers that came and changed us, but we are also aware of the dangers of nationalism, which I think is great that is being discussed. Yeah, and that last statement is also unfortunately very important. And maybe I will just tell you this story and stop, because I know you're tired of my boring talk. The anti-colonial and the anti-Soviet or anti-socialist narratives unable to hear each other. And again, the competitive victimhoods. And I think what happened with the start of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine was another example of that. Like the global South refused to talk about this and refused to take it into account, while in Eastern Europe the situation was different, right? So people who suffered from Soviet Union and from Soviet invasions and from the fact that they were forced into being part of the Second World, they were more attuned and more ready to understand the suffering and what happened in Ukraine. And so, as you know, there was a lot of support from many Eastern European, not from all, but from many, from several. Why? I think that one of the reasons is that there is a narrative of this anti-Soviet narrative that we are all familiar with. Sometimes it's very reactionary, because many of these dissidents were very problematic people, you know, politically, and very racist and very exclusionary, especially if you take, for example, from the Soviet period, and in the West also. They just refused to see that not all of them were Russians, for instance. They just kind of put them all in a conglomerate, and if you were, for example, a dissident from the Caucasus, you were not allowed to be a Caucasus person there, right? A Georgian or Azeri person or something like that. You had to pretend you were Russian. So that way their identities were erased even then. And unfortunately, the trace of this is there. You know, you can see it in many dissident writers. You can see it in many kind of, even today, up to now. And so in that sense, of course, I understand why there was a lack of dialogue, because the anti-colonial discourse was and is leftist. And it still has this connection to some kind of socialist dream, let's say. Maybe not a real one, not some kind of concrete country that they have in mind, but as an ideal. And that's why they don't work together very well unless we do some work, unless we have some discussions. And I experienced that so many times. You know, when I was inviting people for many conferences, I wanted to kind of initiate these dialogues, for example, between feminists from socialist countries in Eastern Europe and people from the global South. Lugones and maybe a couple of others were ready to do that and to see the colonial darker elements of Soviet system, for instance, right, or socialist system. But others were not. You know, it was very often the idea like, oh yeah, but it's European problems. It's problems of the white people. We don't want to talk about that. And then you have to go deep into that. It's like, yeah, but it's not. The Soviet Union was not all European, you know. There were so many people who are not European and not white. They're Muslim. And yeah, but so there is an element of ignorance there also, and lacking interest to learn more about who is actually there. But there is also an element of this maybe unconscious rivalries between different stories and narratives. Like my story is big anti-colonial narrative is more important because there's so many people who suffered in the century. Who wants this discussion of socialism and whatever, you know, Soviet Union is local and unimportant. And those who suffered, who were kind of, you know, their countries were taken over, they were forced to become, you know, part of the socialist system. They also have their point, of course, in this discussion. So the question is how to make them hear each other, because I think it is important. If you think about it, most of the people on this planet are either post-socialist or post-colonial. Yeah? So if we come together and we have a deep coalition, it will be actually very powerful, I think, rather than continuing to compete whose narrative is more important. So this is my maybe open-ended kind of finishing sentence. And maybe a few questions, like can refuturing be decolonial? This is one of the things I work with Tony Fry. He's an Australian designer, very famous philosopher of design. And we wrote this book about new political imagination together, now working on other projects. And we want to take the discussion of colonies, empires, and whatever we have today out of just pastness. Of course, we don't say that it's not important to study the past, it is. but we also want to make it more urgent and kind of trigger a discussion of the future, imagining the future together politically, what kind of future we could have. And first, before we build it, we have to imagine it. And so, for me, the question is, can this future and refuturing the world, reimagining the world with the future in contrast with what we have now, have a decolonial element? And what kind of decoloniality it should be? Like how it should be maybe reformed, reformulated, and reimagined in order to make sense for the future. Yeah, okay, so I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll just, yeah. Thank you so much, Madina. I think we'll eat into lunch, as it were, a little bit, so that we have ample time for discussion. There are so many threads that I personally would like to pull on, but let's turn it over immediately to the audience, I think. Please.
Yeah, I cannot hear you. Let me come closer. Yes.
Yeah, no.
Okay, good.
Thanks. So my name is Jelena, and I'm coming from Serbia. So it is a country that you would probably call semi-peripheral country, whatever. And also I'm Roma. So from my positionality, it's a bit like tricky. So I just wanted to ask you, when you speak about Russia, for example, you say that there is this, that we should treat it in a similar way with other empires. So there is some similarity, right?
Some.
Yeah. So that this is something that you emphasize, that there is similarity, which is usually not considered unjustifiably. That's how I interpret it, at least.
Okay.
On the other hand, when we speak about global West, you say there is this kind of difference that we should also consider. So there is this like the similarity and the differences. There is this politics which you apply in a certain way how you interpret things. So I just wanted to show that there is this kind of politics in it. And when we speak about whiteness, for me it's interesting how you interpret this whiteness in European context, because you say Eastern Europeans are not, they actually are not white. Mm-hmm. So there is this kind of difference that we should think about. So there is, again, this politics of difference and similarity, right? So, and that it's not so simple. But when we saw this Ukraine example that you mentioned, there was this reporting about Ukraine, and you already know, like CBS reporter who spoke that this is not really, this is civilized country, these are people like us. So there was this kind of acknowledgement of similarity of whiteness, right? So for me, I just wanted to say that how do you see this kind of politics in that sense? Because obviously, for these white people who we consider properly white, there is this kind of alliance with Eastern Europeans, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So, exactly. This is yeah. Yeah, exactly. So just wanted to point that there is politics, how we assign relevance to this when he says this approximately white, not just quite white, but we can be on the other political spectrum when we say, but still there is this alliance between white people. So I'm just saying that this is a political positioning, because I would say this ideological stand, when you interpret this, are we similar or are we different? From my positionality as a Roma person, I think I'm standing on a different side when I say, but you know, this difference is important, right?
Yeah, there are many layers. That's what we were telling. Like
Yeah,
you are not only Eastern European, but Eastern European Roma. So.
Want to?
Hi, so I'm gonna actually try to bring this in and focus it as a question. How's that? One of the things I wonder is if somebody in the audience were, for example, a black colleague, would say, how might that perspective be different? And I'll take it from the American perspective. I have a colleague who says that I'm ecru, which is on a shade of white. And if you're thinking in that, how might you respond to that? The difference between sort of what we might look at as those color as opposed to whiteness. Can you expand on that a little bit?
I mean, I don't want to take it to the United States, frankly speaking, because then it's a completely different story. And this is what the problem is with a lot of discourse today, because people take something from America and think it will work in Europe. It doesn't. And the way race works in the United States is completely different from what we have here, and even different from one country to another. And as you know, there are so many complex examples. And when I said about problematic whiteness of Eastern Europeans, that's exactly what I meant, is that it's white in some situations, it's not white in others. And for example, people in the US will not be even sometimes able to see these nuances unless they're trained to, right? For example, I was seen as a white person in the United States, which was so funny, right? Because after being racialized in Russia for so many years, you come there and then they don't see that you're a Muslim and you're not white and you're Asian, and they're not able to see it. And the same in Europe. So it works differently. In Europe, very often things are hidden, the racial things are hidden through class differences, and that kind of is the language that is used instead of racialization. But at the same time, thank you very much for mentioning the case of Roma, because it shows how it's actually a double discourse, because it works as a racialized and racist discourse in relation to certain minorities within Europe, right? But at the same time, the same people who can be acting as racist in relation to Roma people are racialized themselves when they come to Western European countries, and they're seen as some kind of people from Eastern Europe. You know, there are so many racist jokes about Polish people in Great Britain, for instance. So just to give one example, right? So, I mean, it's very complex because it's not race in the understanding of the US. It's a different kind of race that goes through other things, and it has nothing to do with colorism also. It's not about the color of skin, really, you know, or even if you remember in that reporting that you mentioned, they were talking about, yeah, they are blue-eyed and they're blonde Ukrainian children, and you know, all that was there. Yeah, but at the same time, if you look how these Ukrainian refugees are treated in Europe, I'm sorry, you have to then stop all of these discussions, right, and say, oh, they are seen as provisionally European. They are not. They don't have any rights. In some countries like Sweden, they're already trying to get rid of them. I read in the newspaper recently something like, we only can have 1,000 Ukrainians. The rest of them have to go home. So, I mean, they are used as a rhetorical gesture when politicians need it, but then nobody really cares about them as people. Yeah, I don't want to talk more about it. We can discuss it later. But it is a very complex issue. So the point is how people are selectively seen as provisionally white in one situation, but then act as racist in other situations, and we know that is still happening, right? To be taken into consideration in our analysis.
Yes, absolutely. We will have to be relatively concise so that we have opportunity to eat lunch. But I think I saw at least 10 other questions at this point. But okay.
I don't know. Shall I go ahead? Yeah. Thanks a lot. I'll try to be very concise. Thanks a lot for the talk. I skipped the praises to have more time. So there are basically two questions I'm interested in. One is, to which degree could we not say that the depoliticization of decolonial thinking happened also from within? And I'm thinking very specifically of in the way of how like Quijano's own writings are basically or were emptied out of its more radical left-wing content by others like Mignolo. So I think you're far more able to answer this question because you have insight perspective. Just leave the question. I think you know what I mean. And the second thing would be, to which degree does it make sense to speak of the homogeneous Soviet experience, right? And to which degree do we have not also there again hierarchies? Because as someone that has been working a lot both in Armenia and Kyrgyzstan, you definitely have there a total different engagement with the Soviet legacy than you have in the Baltics, which are de facto occupied after World War II, or Ukraine. And it seems that there again we have on a smaller scale a reproduction of the very same hierarchies that we otherwise see on a global. So, but I leave it here to have enough time. Thanks so much for your input.
Okay, thank you. I will try to be very short, although we can talk for a long time about this. The first question answer is yes. That's what I was also trying to say, that they deliberately didn't want to be political or talk about any social movement or revolution or trying to actually change anything. I think it was deliberate. Precisely because they came at that low moment when the socialist system collapsed, the left were defeated, right? Neoliberalism came, anti-colonialism didn't quite work, so that's why. But then increasingly, at least in Mignolo's case, I think it was a question of being a US academic, you know, and sitting in this ivory tower. Not in Quijano's case, but in Walter's case, definitely. I always tell him that. I mean, we have, of course, on friendly basis and all that, and I always say, yeah, it's easy for you sitting in Duke University. You don't understand other people, you know, and their problems. So yes, it's there, unfortunately. And the second, absolutely, that's the point, that our experience was completely different. I cannot explain many things to my Russian friends or colleagues. I mean, I don't have that many Russian friends for obvious reasons. But I mean, they just don't understand this, you know, because they never were racialized, because they never went through the specific kind of coloniality that we went through, right? And as you said, like, you cannot compare Estonia and Kyrgyzstan. Yeah? And even today, when you go to Kyrgyzstan, their attitude to Russification and Soviet modernity is very different, and maybe less negative even than in some cases with the Baltic countries. And yeah, it needs to be not homogenized, and it still is. I mean, especially in the West again, but also in the global South. So people don't know the differences. They homogenize. They think that only Russians live in Russia, right, or in Soviet Union, and that's something that always bothered me. Now, when I was 4 years old, I was starting to read in Russian, of course, because there was no other language you could learn. And at some point, there was a box in the store, and something was written in, not in Cyrillic, but in Latin alphabet. And I was trying to read, and I was bothered that I couldn't. And one of our family friends was very cynical, and she said, so you cannot read in Latin yet? And I said, I read only in Soviet. In Soviet, not in Russian, because it was Soviet Union, and I was claiming that I have the right to do that because I'm not Russian and I don't want to read in Russian. But that shows that kind of, you know, tension that was always there even in the early 70s when I was growing up. Okay.
Okay, so it's on, yes? Yeah, okay. Okay, so I will like point at the fact that there is totally, I come from Poland, so there is like a difference. And Poland, in Poland we are trying to develop something like subaltern studies. I don't know if you, yeah. So I would like to, so my question is about how you would position yourself, position colonial thinking in front of this question. For those who don't know, subaltern studies are trying to acknowledge also all this complication. And Poland is a good positionality for that. Poland was partitioned between German Empire, and that part of Poland we
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good point. I mean, I didn't have time to go into that. And to me, it's kind of obvious that both positions are important, right? And as you said, it's very rarely that we find it. But I think that I'm dealing more with very critical Eastern European feminist thinkers who are actually aware of this. And they were among the first who read postcolonial theory and started trying to apply it to their situation. So maybe I don't personally see that much, but I read several works of this Polish subaltern group. I don't like the name subaltern, though. Again, I mean, why would you use the Indian name? And because it's very misleading. It's a very different type of discourse, right? And as you said, there is a tendency of saying that we are European and we don't want to be part of this barbaric, but not only in Poland. You find this in Baltic countries as well, and in some other places as well. And again, many of my co-authors and collaborators in Estonia, for instance, they are very, very critical of that too, right? And so recently there was a conference organized by my Ukrainian colleagues in Stockholm, and there were many Ukrainian delegates in the conference, but also from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and other places. And that's exactly the question that came, because when somebody was talking from the Ukrainian position, and of course we cannot criticize it in the present situation, but the point was that we want to go back to Europe, we are European, and this barbaric Asiatic Russia, and people sitting there from Asia were kind of not comfortable with that, and they said, what about us? What about the global coloniality, the Western coloniality? You cannot forget about this kind of element, right? So that's what I mean by double critique. Like, you have to juggle this. You cannot go into one direction and only argue for one side of it. And I think that in many decolonialists, it's the opposite. Like, they just think that whoever criticizes the US is good, even if it's Putin, right? But the opposite is also problematic, of course, right? So it has to be balanced. Okay, thank you.
So unfortunately, we are now really quite running into lunch. So we'll take one more very brief, and I genuinely apologize that there are not more hours in the day.
Is there?
No, it's over here. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I was just wondering if you could very briefly tell us a little bit more about decoloniality through design, because we keep referring to racial, ethnic categories and all that, but you actually specialize in art and design, so could you say just a few words about decoloniality through design?
It's a good question. I mean, I wasn't thinking that I would ever write anything about it, but it was Tony Fry who asked me. He was doing some collection. What is better? He was doing a collection of articles about design in the Global South for the Global South, and he asked me to write, and that was a text I did, like how do you decolonize design, and if you can do it. I think that I come more from Tony's perspective that design is an ontological exercise. Like, design is not about pretty things or hygge or something like that, right? It's more about very, very substantial, essential, existential things. It's a way of worlding, right? And so if you look at design like that, then you can probably think of decolonizing your frameworks, the way you look at the world, the way you relate to the world. That, I think, is most important. That design is not instrumental. It lies in the core of things, of how we kind of see the world and relate to it and remake it and do this thing that Tony calls, and not only Tony, but many other designers call it thinkering. Thinking with your hands. So it's like not thinking and not tinkering, but something in between. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madina. Just a few brief housekeeping announcements. First, apologies again for not